Welcome to the Susan Brender Show. It's all about you, featuring shows on health and wellness, the performing arts, politics, and people who inspire you to be your very best. And now, here's Susan Brender.
Are you a business owner tired of paying exorbitant credit card fees? Call now to get an evaluation. If we cannot beat your current prices, you receive a $250 credit card. Call 818-583-7328 for more information. I'm Susan Brender, and this is the Susan Brender Show. Today, I'm very pleased to have Ray Guttard on my show. Now, Ray is a paraplegic, and he works for the largest retailer in the world, and I have seen some of the things that he does as a paraplegic, and I think it's just absolutely incredible. He has multiple degrees and certifications in various things. He loves helping people and making their lives better, and I want to welcome Ray Guttard to our show and say to him, there are so many things, Ray, that I want you to talk about because you're in a position where you've had to probably work very hard to try to accomplish the things that you have. So let's start by asking you the following thing. I want you to tell me your story, a little bit about what it was like growing up as a paraplegic.
Well, the interesting thing about that is it started a lot later, like about halfway through high school. Basically, I got myself into a car accident that had injured me in such a way that made me a paraplegic. I got a L1 vertebrae burst fracture is what they call, and it severed my spinal cord from pretty much the waist down. So that's what happened. Going back to school was a bit of an issue, and I had to do some homeschooling for a little while and outpatient stuff and physical rehabilitation and learning how to do everything again, even like simple things like just getting dressed and learning how to drive a car, things that, you know, young teenagers kind of take for granted, but was a whole new experience for me, honestly.
Wow. So prior to that, you were just an average young teenager or young man, and your life was based upon what? What was your, sort of the things that you did? Were you involved in sports? Did you, was going to school a challenge? Tell us a little bit about yourself again.
Well, when I was younger, I was kind of I wouldn't say a delinquent, but I did well in school, but I was pretty involved in sports, actually. In middle school, I did a lot of basketball, and in high school, I actually was in track a lot. I spent a good amount of my time throughout all my school years in chorus, though. So I spent a great amount of time singing and being in front of people and on stage. And in high school, even after the accident, I went back and I started doing drama, so I did a lot of plays, and that was actually a tremendous, awesome, fun time.
Wow. Yeah, I could imagine. How did it affect your parents?
Well, interestingly enough, my mom was a nurse, and she still is a nurse, actually. Hi, Mom.
Yeah.
She was pretty much the most pivotal part of that whole process. She supported me in everything that I did, every good or bad decision I ever made, and she got me transferred to her hospital during my physical therapy, like the 2 months while I was still in the hospital, and she got another bed set up in my room so that way she could be right there with me the whole time.
Oh, she was a wonderful mother. That's terrific.
Oh, she's amazing. The strongest person I know. I would not be the man I am today without her, certainly.
So let's get into things. Now, you mentioned basketball, and one of the things that I've seen for quite some time on TV is people who are in wheelchairs who are playing actually basketball in their wheelchairs and also sort of dancing, if you will. I remember, I'm just going to tell you a little story that years ago I was involved in a dance company. I was the media person for a dance company. And what I saw was a man who had no legs. But he used to be a fabulous dancer, a contemporary dancer, and just with his body, he could move along the floor and create kind of a image of a dancer. It was fabulous to see that. Now, when I tell you something like this, how do you respond to the way I'm discussing how this man without legs was able to do gorgeous things?
Well, I think it's amazing, honestly. But for me, it feels almost like commonplace because after I got my accident, I started doing wheelchair basketball. I did that for about 2 years. After that, I moved on to tennis. Tennis is my heart and soul right now. I love playing wheelchair tennis.
Ray. I must stop you. How does somebody in a wheelchair play tennis?
The nice thing about tennis is you don't need any other special equipment. You don't have to do anything weird or go past any sort of strangeness. You just have to have a racket, and you can play against somebody else. All the rules are the same. The courts, obviously you can't play in, like, grass courts, but regular old, like, hardtop court, the only different rule is that people in chairs get 2 bounces, but if you're good enough, you never need 2 bounces.
That's amazing. Also, I've seen people who are paraplegic actually ski. Do you do that as well?
Yeah, I've gone skiing a couple of times. There was one funny time. The first time I went out, there was another guy who was giving me a hand with it. He was kind of showing me how to do it. And he went up on this little ramp, and he got some air, and it was super cool. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to do that too. So I did the same thing. I went up on the ramp, and then I kind of spun a little bit in the air and just landed straight on my face. I didn't get hurt, but it was
You're probably not
fun.
alone with that. Even people who are, quote-unquote, have healthy bodies, they land on their face and sometimes land on other things. But let's get involved a little bit in how it's changed your life. Is it better or is it worse?
In some respects, better. In some respects, worse. I always like to say that it puts a different perspective on the world for me. It changed how I thought about everything, how I perceived things. So now something that is a pretty commonplace issue, like, going in your front door with groceries in your hand is a pretty simple task that you probably don't even think 2 thoughts about. Whereas for me, I have to set the groceries down, get myself up over the lip of the doorway, and then put the groceries inside, close the door with like a reacher or something else so I don't fall backwards. There's a lot you have to think about. Benefits, though, I get to cut in line at Disney. That's always fun.
Okay. I love it.
Yeah.
Go on.
It's provided me a lot of new perspectives on life and different appreciations for other people and empathy, because being in this situation helps me see what it's like for other people in similar situations.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because there's a lot of guys and a lot of women who are coming back from places around the world where, like Afghanistan, Iraq, and all these different places, and they're dealing with PTSD because whatever they saw was just horrible. And some of them are coming back in your condition where they really can't walk anymore because they've been shot or there's been a bomb that's gone off. Now, as an inspirational speaker, if you put yourself in that kind of position, what would you tell them?
The first thing I would tell them is it's not over. Your life isn't over. Because that's the first thought that I had, that this is it, I'm done. Because I was a track star, I was running fastest. I was like, well, I can't do that anymore. And sometimes you just need someone else who's in a similar situation as you just to say, it's not the end. This is not the ending of the period. This is a start of a new life. Yes, you're going to have to learn new things. Yes, there's going to be problems. You're going to have to overcome some huge challenges. But you can. You just have to focus on it and do it. Nothing to it but to do it.
Yeah, that's a good little scenario. Nothing to it, but you can do it. I love it. I love that.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a great start for a discussion, But let's go on for a second. And my kind of impression is that mental health professionals, while they're trained to deal with people with, mental issues, are they trained, and in your opinion, and have you experienced how mental health practitioners deal with people with disabilities?
Well, I'll be honest with you. I've seen a couple of mental health professionals. I wouldn't really consider myself an actual professional, but I'm studied and knowledgeable in the realm of psychology and behavioral psychology. That's where my bachelor's degree is in. And I feel like it's a level of empathy and care, because at the end of the day, a doctor, whether it be a medical or a psychological doctor, is there to help the person. And I think sometimes the job of it and the paperwork and all the other stuff kind of gets in the way of a doctor helping a person. That's like the end-all, be-all of it. You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I hear you. Please go on. Let me hear more, because I think that's really true.
Yeah, it's an empathetic level. Like, I've dealt with neurosurgeons, probably neurosurgeons in general. I don't want to say all neurosurgeons, but pretty much most of the neurosurgeons that I have worked with have been just these kind of cold, very like sterile, this is your problem, this is what it is, and that's it. And again, sometimes you just need somebody who's been in that situation, who's gone through it, to tell you it's going to be okay. That's, at the end of the day, that's all it is. Because if someone tells you, yeah, you can't walk, but you'll be all right, you'll be fine, and then they walk out of the room, it's like they have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. So you're saying that people like you and people who are in your position should be actually training the professionals, because you understand what you're going through and what other people are going through, and how much importance you should put to empathizing for the people who are dealing with these issues. Now, let's. I always like my guests to tell a little story, something that happened to them or something that they observed that they thought was a really interesting way for people to understand the situation that you're in.
Do I have a good story? I mean, I have my particular accident story, but I don't want to tell that story. I want a nicer story. Okay, this one's kind of fun. So when I was a little bit younger, in my early 20s, I went to a lot of clubs and, like late night excursions and stuff. And there was one time I was at a party with my girlfriend, and this was like packed, shoulder to shoulder, wall to wall people, right? And we were trying to leave the dance floor area and attempt to get go get a drink or whatever. And I'm like tapping folks and, hey, please excuse me, sorry, And I get one guy's attention. He looks over first, at regular eye level height, and then he looks down at me, and he's like, oh, you see, like, the shock and realization on his eyes. And he goes, oh, and then he starts moving people out of the way. And initially, every person has the same reaction. They're like, what are you doing? And then they see, and then it was like the parting of the Red Sea. It's just like the line, this perfect like red carpet that opened up for me, and we're like, oh, well, thank you guys, I really appreciate it. And it kind of, it sort of showed something to me that people have a different perception of people who have like visible physical maladies, right? Something you can easily see and say that person's got a thing. People react differently to it. It's interesting. It's interesting.
very interesting, and it sounds also like people judge you when you're in a different situation than they are, like in your situation where you sit in a wheelchair, or if somebody has some kind of disability that is very obvious, and so you find that people treat you differently. Now, that leads me to something else, and that is that the government started a program years ago where they built these platforms so that you could get out of restaurants or different kinds of buildings, and that was a big move. I mean, because years ago, I mean, there's no comparison to what you're going through or what you dealt with. But in my particular case, I broke my heel, okay? I broke my heel in a car accident as well. And getting upstairs was very difficult for me for the first 6 weeks of my trying to get well, healing my foot. And it was such an enlightenment for me, Ramey, where I saw that there were so many places that wouldn't be, where people with disabilities wouldn't be able to get in. And then all of a sudden you have these ramps. Now, if there is something that the government can put into the law and do something for people with handicaps, what would you suggest that be?
I think more of a social support structure would be beneficial, because when I first got into my chair, and maybe about a year or two after, I started working with a Florida Spinal Cord Injury Resource Center, and I would actually do what I was describing earlier: go to hospitals, to people who were recently injured with all kinds of spinal cord injuries, and I would be that person to tell them, hey, it's not the end. And, give them resources, maybe some places where they could get job opportunities or maybe some training, things like that. That center lost its funding, so that doesn't exist anymore. Not only was it a very fruitful, like fulfilling job, but it was really helpful for just the basic community. And I still kind of do that on the side, because I have a couple of friends in hospitals who let me know. So I'll go over and meet with somebody and just talk to them. But I think a program like that, even something small, could be very beneficial for the long run for all these individuals.
Yeah, I think it sounds wonderful. Ramey, another thing is, let's talk about, we won't mention the name of the organization or the place that you work, because in all fairness, there are a lot of other places that employ people with disabilities. But you're employed in a place that is a very big organization. How do they treat people with your kind of disability?
It comes down to an individual by individual basis, because every place is different. You have different levels of management, and they treat people differently. At the end of the day, I haven't really had much in the form of discrimination or any real issues. If I've ever had a problem, someone's always there to help. And very rarely do I ever have an extenuating circumstance that gets in the way, that makes it harder, because I just want to do my job, right? At the end of the day, I just want to be able to come into work, do what I'm there to do, and be done with it. Yeah, some things are a little bit harder. It's harder for me to pull a cart than somebody else, but it doesn't mean that the company's making it harder for me. I'm making it harder for myself sometimes.
Yeah, I bet. Now, so the company encourages people with disabilities to work for them?
Yeah, absolutely. And there are lots of programs within the company. If you have issues, you can petition for accommodations. And I haven't seen anybody get denied for an accommodation. And I've put in a couple of accommodations. I mean, just simple things like a little grabber reacher for me to use while I'm working, some small stuff, maybe when I worked in the office for a little while, adjustment of a desk height. I mean, it's not exactly the end of the world, but they were very prompt and responded to me quickly and resolved the issue quickly too. So that's awesome. That's amazing.
That is awesome. And I'll tell you something. If a company like yours is doing that for people with disabilities, I think there are a lot of other companies that can learn from you because, or learn from them, because people, again, in situations where they have, certain things that don't allow them to be exactly like the people who are able to walk or whatever. There's things to learn. Now, what about Florida? Is Florida, and, I should tell the audience that both you and I are in Florida. Is Florida a very forward state that really addresses the problems of disabilities? Do you know about that at all?
From as far as just like getting around and like going from place to place, I never really encountered much issues. Like, there's always handicap parking spots, which is helpful. Sometimes it's taken up by some of the older generation. There's some people who might not necessarily need it, but whatever. If you got the placard, it's fine. I've never come across, or at least very, very rarely, have I come across any establishment that wasn't properly set up for me to get into. There was one time where I went to, I think it was Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, and there was like an old town, like, oh, it's historic Georgia, and every place was inaccessible. I couldn't get in anywhere.
Wow.
It was actually kind of surprising. I was like, okay, so this is what it's like. And I've been in North Carolina where my brother lives, and the same thing up there. You have like the historic section, or there's just too many hills. It's a pretty flat plain down here in Florida, and I like that.
Yeah. I'm happy to hear that. I'm happy to hear that Florida is progressive when it comes to dealing with people with disabilities. But there is something that all these other states need to learn, that people with disabilities exist. And because of issues with war or whatever, there's more people than ever that are dealing with handicaps. So therefore, they need people like you to kind of tell them that they have to make changes. Now, I always like my guests to have the last word. Is there something that you would like to tell our audience?
Well, I'm going to use a quote. It's a quote that I took from my mother, and I've adopted it, and I use it whenever it's kind of like my last point. So if you're okay with that, I'm okay with
Absolutely.
that. My mom always told me that attitude is everything. Your attitude can change an ordeal, something negative, into an adventure, something positive, right? You can just, based on the way you perceive things, you can change a bad situation into something positive. So I've always used that from her. Again, I love my mom. She's great.
Well, you have reason to love her. She sounds like a wonderful person. I'll tell you, she sounds so great. Well, my guest today has been Ramy, or as he calls himself, Ray Guttard, who has a lot to say about people with disabilities and the kinds of things that can be done to make it easier for them and make life just special. So, again, Ramy, thank you so very much for being on the Susan Brender Show.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Susan Brender Show. To be a guest, email sebrender@yahoo.com.